Hello, everyone. Oh, what a nice room of wonderful friends and family and lovers of poetry here tonight. My name is Jackie Wong, and I'm really honored to be your host this evening. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the shape of our time together before we get started. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation with Kyla. We'll hear her read some poems, and we're going to have a brief 5-minute intermission for rest and mingling at 7:30. And then we'll wrap up at about 8 o'clock. And again, as Andrew said, you're very welcome to get up and have a cup of tea or do whatever you need to do during our time together. And I really want to thank Andrew for all of what you do to make these residencies run so beautifully. And I know that they impact a great many people in the city. And there have been so many special writers who've come through the Writers in Residency program. And Kyla, the 20th person in this, is one of them. I met Kyla many years ago when she was a graduate student in the Master of Fine Arts program at the University of British Columbia. I was at the time a young and harried adjunct instructor, and Kyla was assigned to be a teaching assistant in my class. And the minute that she walked in and we had this big meeting, it was very chaotic. It was September. Campus was so busy. And she immediately started asking questions about equity and access and how our students would feel included and safe in our time together. And I was always so struck by that. And I've learned so much from Kyla over the years. She's taught me so much about how the personal intersects with the professional. Over the time that we worked together, she was such a talented educator. Even then, she was a student technically, but would come in and lecture in my classes and was just really wonderful and brilliant with students. And we actually ended up being neighbors in the same neighborhood for a little while. I still miss those years of bumping into her around South Granville, where we both used to live. And I'm just so pleased to be able to have known her through that time and in the time that she published her chapbook, Kind of Animal, in 2020. 2019 actually, and then Body Count in 2020. So those were really big, I think, transformative years for many people happening in the pandemic. And I think that the poetry that Kyla wrote in both of these collections really resonated with so many folks over such an important and transformative period of time. I guess that's my personal introduction to Kyla, but professionally, I also want to tell you a little bit about her before we invite her to the stage to read a poem. Kyla Jamieson holds a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing from the University of British Columbia. Her first book, Body Count, was a CBC Best Poetry Book of the Year in 2020 and was shortlisted for the Pat Lowther Memorial Award. So please join me in welcoming Kyla Jamieson. She's going to share one poem with us before we get started in conversation. Welcome, Kyla.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I didn't know that the itinerary for the event was that Jackie would talk and I would cry. But now that we've gotten that first part out of the way, I will just read a poem from my book, Body Count, just to kind of set the tone for our conversation. It's called I Need a Poem. Can we talk about the moon tonight? Low and full in the baby blue sky. A friend at my door, the sound of her laugh and well-loved heart. I want to be held up like that. I need a poem about happiness I haven't written yet, an ode to the ducks in my neighbor's pool, another for the pink magnolias of spring. Some trees make it look so easy. Yes, I can hold all this beauty up. I think a lot of poetry readings, people don't really clap after a poem, and I love that this space claps after a poem, so thank you.
Welcome, Kyla. I thought that was beautiful. I want to clap every time I hear you read poetry.
I want to clap every time anyone reads a poem.
I do.
I want to clap anytime anyone at home reads a poem to themselves.
Yes.
Just imagine me applauding you.
Sometimes I'm applauding while reading your poem in a book by myself at home. So I wonder if we could begin by hearing a little bit from you about why poetry, and if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to poetry as a writer.
Yes. Yeah, when I was fortunate enough to work with Jackie at UBC, I was mostly writing creative nonfiction. And it was only after I had a concussion that I really shifted my focus to poetry, because I suddenly could not do most things, including read and write sentences. And so that really shaped my work and my writing. And it's part of why a lot of the poems in my book are shaped in these like really narrow columns and have these really short lines, because that was, and honestly still is, like the easiest thing for me to read personally. And so there's this kind of like accessibility that was at the forefront of my work in terms of me making it accessible for myself. But then I've also always been interested in poetry that can be made more accessible for other people, because I think so often people feel like poetry is like the territory of like the academy or these like super intellectual people or whatever it might be. And I really feel like poetry is for all of us. And that's something that I've always wanted to keep at the forefront of my work. But I think as someone who kind of like became the writer that I am because I was working within so many limitations, I'm really interested in like bringing other people towards and into writing who maybe can relate to that in some way. And so that's why like the main workshop that I'm teaching here is called Poetry is for Everyone. Yeah.
That's such a great title. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what the work is right now and what you're hoping to do in the residency.
Yeah. The work right now. Okay, so the work for the residency is we are doing all these workshops, which I'm really excited about. And then I'm also doing one-on-one consultations. So if any of you want to come talk about writing or have me read your writing, that's what those are for. So yeah, we're doing just like workshops throughout the next few months, and then consultations starting more in October. And that's like the work of the residency is just like making poetry accessible, making like my, for whatever it's worth, feedback on people's work, and engagement with people's work, and also just their process of becoming like the writer that they are accessible. And then part of the work of the residency is working on my own creative work. And so that for me is, I'm working on my second book, and so much of that book is trying to put language to silence, and writing about these really difficult years when I was so sick with so many things that were so hard to get to the bottom of. And I was really like separated from language in a lot of ways. And so it's been a really interesting experience of trying to find the language for being beyond language. And that's part of what that project is. And then also trying to, you know, as Andrew has recommended to me, have fun with language as well, and write some poems that are like more rooted in the joy of the present moment, which is really beautiful too. I was going to read a poem.
I was going to ask if you had one about that. I think that there's so much of your work that really roots itself in that special intersection around finding language and allowing joy to surface, particularly after hardship. And I find that's something that continues to always move me about your work. And I think that that's like such a wonderful invitation from Andrew, but also something that many of us need right now too.
Okay, so this poem is more about like getting to the place where the joy comes into the language. But it's called Feeling Walks Ahead of Language Like a Prophet. And it opens with this quote from Clarice Lispector: "I am obscure to myself." I haven't been writing. I've been asking questions and swimming beneath the quiet sky. I'd tell you the questions I'm living, but I have no language for them yet. I understand the philosopher who said the limits of his language were the limits of his world, but I live my life in the mud where syllables tangle before turning into sound. There's this Rilke quote, live the questions. And that's also what a lot of my second book is about. And I think probably with my first book too, I could say like, oh, these were the questions that I was living. But that's something that I'm always curious about when I interact with other people's work, is like, and understanding other people as writers too. It's like, what are the questions that you're living now? And I think like everybody has questions that they're living in this moment. And that's something that I think like if I could just ask every stranger a question, that would be probably my top pick. Yeah.
I love that question about embodiment and about that wonderful invitation to connect that which is physical and kinetic with what's happening in our minds and in our hearts. And I've always loved the way that you've brought those two spaces together, particularly in the way that act actively dismantles the kind of academic encrustment sometimes that surrounds poetry and poetry work.
It's so interesting to think of language as a tool that we can use to take what our bodies know and bring it into our minds, or bring it into the world to share with other people or to connect with other people through. And also, while we're talking about this, like if anybody at any point tonight wants to just like get up and stretch or walk around or whatever you need to do, please do, and let your bodies teach us how to be in this space. But yeah, I think that that's part of the work too. Is it's like there's so much that I think our bodies know that our minds forget, and trying to find a way to remember those things as a poet or as a person working in language. I'm sorry, I'm way too quiet. Yeah, trying to find a way to stay connected to that as a person who is theoretically mostly using my brain for my work, but also not always just focused on using my brain. I think it's just such an interesting challenge and a necessary challenge. Yeah.
Well, let's take some of that reflection into the break.
Yeah.
Speaking of,
we're going to take a break.
Having a little embodied practice.
I love an intermission. I'm an intermission advocate. I think that's my actual bio. So we're going to take a 5-minute break because
Kyla is going to read a poem to us before we get started into some more conversation. Thanks.
I hope everybody had a good break. I think breaks are very important. I'm going to read this new poem that I wrote like last summer, and it's probably going to be part of my third book. But it's kind of about like coming back to life a little bit. And it's called Tell Me Again How Beautiful Life Can Be. Sometimes I want to forget what I've learned from fear and fatigue, how to make a life smaller, whittle it down to a sliver, and guard it. I want to fall in love and forget how love ends. I want to push my body without considering what effort has cost me. I want to outrun hesitation and caution. Let me forget just for 137 meters, just one length of this coastline pool. One drive up a winding highway in the midday sun. One moonlit night sleeping next to you. I swim until I'm out of breath. I sleep the afternoon away. I wake to golden light, thirst, the slow shift into consciousness from dreamless sleep. I reach for water. I reach for the shirt you left here. I reach for a future that feels like sunshine, like a cold river, like a new story, like a conversation that continues across tides and moons and selves. I enter each day a body, awed by her own presence in the world.
So beautiful. Thank you, Kyla. So I wonder if we can, that this poem was such a lovely opening for this next question that I have. And I'm curious about if you can tell us about what's top of mind for you when you think about the future that you're writing towards, that you're working towards?
I think I am in this interesting place where I'm supposedly an expert on language in a certain way as a poet. But I actually feel like most of the work of the past 7 years of my life has been not the work of becoming a poet or mastering language or any of that, but the work of survival. And now I get to, I think, hopefully become a poet who isn't solely focused on survival, which means that I get to discover language in a new way. I think I found in the process of becoming a poet, I was finding the language that I needed in order to survive, and I became the poet that I needed to be in order to survive. And I think this is, I hope, the era of my life where I get to become the poet that I want to be, not the poet that I had to be. And I've heard this said for people in general, that maybe like the first quarter of your life, you become the person that you have to be, and then the second quarter of your life, you get to become the person that you want to be. Or maybe people divide it into halves. Like the first half is all about duty and responsibility, and the second half is about self-actualization. And however you demarcate those seasons of a life, I think it's a huge privilege to not only have to focus on survival. And so I think as I look towards the future, finding the language for a life that isn't solely oriented around survival to help realize the vision for that life is part of the work. But then I think also, I mean, so much of my work in survival within language has been focused also on bringing concepts like principles from disability justice and ideas around accessibility and disability and chronic illness and health and these paradigms that kind of trap us all into certain behaviors and beliefs around health and wellness into language. And I think so much of what has driven me as a poet has been like just needing to communicate to people, like, listen, the way that we're all invested in doing things isn't the way that it has to be, and it can actually be so much more gentle for so many of us. And so when I think collectively about the future, that's what I'm oriented towards, is like greater gentleness and ease and care and interconnection. And that's like the future that I'm dreaming and writing towards. And it's so interesting that we're talking now. And like this week, I really had to remind myself that it's 2024. And like that I'm 34 years old and I'm not 27, because I mean, a lot of my writing is about having a concussion and the way that was like severely disabling for me. And I had another concussion recently, and I had to remind myself, like, you're not the person you were then when that happened, and this is like a different experience. And it is 2024. And yet also, I feel like there's so much that we collectively have not processed about even just the past year, but then also the pandemic, which is still ongoing, and these just giant challenges that we've been faced with. And I think that so much of like what I feel in the world right now is so deeply understandable and relatable, and also so like spiky to me. And a lot of it is this like cognitive dissonance around what we've all been through, and just this desire to kind of just like move on and not need to process any of it. But I think, you know, we do have a lot to process, and a lot of it doesn't have to be done in isolation, and we can do it together. And maybe language can be a tool to help us do that. And so then a lot of my work right now is about care and joy and these things that hopefully can be part of that process. Yeah.
So many important reflections here about collective liberatory futures and what we can all think about as we go about our lives, and how do we work collectively to bring these futures into being.
And the thing is like, it can be joyful. Like care can be abundant and not be a burden. That's like my theory. And I'm someone who, because of my experiences, like always thinks and writes and has spoken so much about things like ableism. And I think what people don't, I think that if we could all get invested in dismantling ableism, we would have such a gentle experience in the world, because ableism does not only affect people with disabilities. Like, ableism is why, we're expected to sit in a chair and work like 40 hours a week. And ableism is why, you feel bad if you take a sick day. And ableism is why you feel like you should be able to do all of the things and then feel shame when you're tired. Like, ableism is not something that is only felt by people who identify as having a disability. And so when I think about the future that we can all share, it's a more accessible future, and it has to be. And it's a place where the role that each of us has in creating that future is not coming from an ableist expectation. And it's not the expectation of perfectionism. And it's not the expectation that your role in change should be anything that is at odds with your body or at odds with your mind. And that's also something I have to remind myself of all the time, is like, okay, if you think this is what your role has to be, but it makes you sick, that can't be your role. There has to be a role for each of us that is not at odds with, our spirit or our body or our vitality. But I do always ask, like, when I think about the future, how present can care be? And what if, like, care was enjoyable? And what if care wasn't something that we had to pay for every single time? Like, any time that you want healing or care these days, it feels like you have to go spend $100 in a medical office under fluorescent lights and, like, in stale air. And I think also that's when we can look to nature. And the natural world is like a place that offers us so much healing and doesn't demand anything in return.
So special. I wonder if we might want to kind of take this and to process it with maybe a piece of your writing, and then maybe we can, a poem for every occasion.
I have a poem for that.
And then maybe we can move into some questions from the audience.
Yeah. Found the poem. It's almost like we planned this. This poem is called "The Future Rewards Our Love," and it's from my friend Afua. I keep waking in the early morning dark because my arm is numb, asleep. Is it dreaming? What can it tell me about our future? About the reimagining of care? Who participates and when? And with how much joy? With how much love?
So much interesting and beautiful reflection that you've shared with us. And I wonder if there's anybody in the audience who wished to ask a question to Kyla or wanted to maybe reflect on some of what we're hearing. We have time for 3, I think. Go ahead. Thank you.
I was wondering, how do you yourself define a poem? Regardless of how poems might be. Like, if I have a piece of writing for myself, and call it poem, who's the judge to say, no, this is a piece of
I think that in my experience, poets tend not to be very invested in gatekeeping what a poem is. Like maybe people who aren't poets. So I don't think it's my role to tell anyone like what is or isn't a poem. And I actually love kind of pushing the limits of what people would say like can or can't be a poem, and making a joke a poem, or going like, can I write a poem that's one word, or can I write a poem that has no words? I think what I will say is that I tend to think of poetry as the form of feeling. And I think of things like fiction and nonfiction as places for maybe more so imagination or ideas. But I really think of poetry as the medium that we go to translate feeling into language, and then from language into the feelings of the reader, which is also just such a miraculous thing that can happen. And in that sense, I feel like maybe we all have like a slightly different understanding of like what constitutes a poem or what hits as a poem for us. But I think you know it when you feel it. That's what I would say. Thank you for the question.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for the way you speak. I'm from Mexico. For me to warm hear this kind of voice that really reflects not only your poetry, also your soul. So thank you for that.
Thank
I think
you.
that poetry is about soul. It's
Yeah.
about these material things that we don't understand with words beyond that. And my question is about new generations. It's about what will happen, how you visualize that we can transmit the magic of poetry, the, 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 the wellness that gives us poetry to these new generations that maybe are not too close to its power, or how you visualize poetry between the new gens of humans.
I guess it's an interesting moment because, you know, maybe as a culture, we've moved away a little bit from like literature and we have all these other medias and technologies fighting for our attention. And I think there are definitely people who have thought much more deeply than I have about how that influences young people. But I also think that children are natural poets, you know, and so I don't think it's about like teaching kids how to be poets, but like creating spaces that enable them to continue to be poets. Because children say the most poetic things, I find. And it must be also something like about the developing mind and how it works that is like particularly aligned with poetry. And so I don't think that, I'm not concerned. I'm not worried. Like I have a lot of faith in young people and in younger generations. And I think that it's honestly incredible to talk to young people and some of the tenderness that they're capable of sharing, and some of the ideas that they're capable of grappling with, blow my mind. Because I've seen young people just share the most incredible like comprehensions and conversations that I think would have eluded me at their age. So I feel like the youth are doing good for us.
And thank you for bringing your child too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question over here.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for the question. Writing can be a wonderful therapeutic tool, and there's research on that. And one of the things that I heard that was really interesting was that it can be a good tool until you find yourself repeating the same story about a trauma over and over. And then at that point, you're supposed to stop. And this is like in regards to one specific like therapeutic mode of journaling. But that was something that was really interesting to me. I think there's potential and limitations to writing as a therapeutic tool. And I always say that like nobody believes in both more than I do. Like I absolutely believe so much in the power of language and poetry. And I also know that there was a time when I was so incredibly sick and unwell, and there was absolutely nothing that I felt that poetry could do for me. And sometimes you need like real diagnosis and real medicine. And it can be incredibly romantic to think that poetry can heal everything. But I do think that like on a spiritual level and on a level of purpose and meaning, poetry has been a lifeline for me that I would have felt very lost without, and I'm really grateful to have had. So yeah, I'm a big believer in poetry, and also really good healthcare for everyone.
That's a wonderful note to end on. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us tonight. This has been such a wonderful evening, such a lovely conversation. I didn't think that I was going to I knew I was going to cry at some point, but I didn't think I would cry during the Q&A. So thank you for that. And I hope that everybody has a lovely evening. There's still some space here to mingle and hang out if you'd like. And I hope you have a lovely evening. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.